That evening's dinner began with a single sentence that froze the entire room. "I think you should transfer the house to my name, Mom. There's no point in you keeping the papers." Clara's tone was gentle, sweet as honey, yet in her eyes shimmered a coldness Helen had never seen before in her daughter. Outside the window, June rain drummed softly on the roof, the steady rhythm like the quickened breath of a heart being crushed. Helen Gardner sat motionless at the dining table, her hands trembling slightly over the white tablecloth. She was 64, her face lined with time, yet still carrying the grace of a woman who had spent her life teaching piano. This house was her world, the place her late husband Thomas had built brick by brick with his calloused hands. And now that same house had become something to be divided and claimed by the very daughter for whom she had sacrificed her youth. Clara took a sip of red wine, her lips curling faintly. "I just want what's best for you, Mom." Or, "You're not young anymore. If anything were to happen, having it under my name would make things easier." Darren, her husband, sat across from her with a thin smile, turning his glass slowly, as though making calculations. "Actually, I agree with Clara," he said smoothly. "It's risky when property is in an older person's name. Someone might take advantage of you." Take advantage. The phrase pierced Helen's chest like an icy needle. Who was taking advantage of whom? She looked at them, the young couple sitting in the home she had designed, the warm light from the crystal chandelier, casting a soft glow on their self-satisfied faces. They came every week, dining, drinking, speaking kindly, and now they were planning to strip away the last thing connecting her to the memory of her husband. Helen pressed her lips together. "Let me think about it, dear." "There's nothing to think about, Mom." Clara interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "I just want to keep you from trouble. I'll have the lawyer prepare the documents you'll only need to sign." Darren nodded, the false patience of someone who believed he already held the winning move. Helen looked at her daughter and at the man who had once promised to cherish her as a treasure, then slowly set her fork down on the porcelain plate. The sound of metal striking china was dry and sharp like the crack of trust breaking. Dinner ended in silence. When the door finally closed, Helen sat alone in the quiet kitchen, the only sound the rain tapping against the window. She thought of Clara's joyful eyes the day she received her college diploma. Helen had worked 15 years for that moment, teaching piano by day and cleaning hotel rooms by night so her daughter could have a future. Now that same daughter spoke to her with the voice of a stranger. Helen rose and walked around the room. The family photo on the wall showed them by the lakeside years ago, Thomas standing in the middle with his arm around her and 10-year-old Clara beaming with laughter. The picture cut through her memory like a blade. She whispered softly, "Thomas, if you were still here, you'd know what to do." That night, she didn't sleep. The pendulum clock in the living room swung steadily, counting the slow seconds. Helen sat by the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked garden. She remembered every small detail of the house, the bricks Thomas had laid by hand, the faint scent of pine in the hallway, the echo of Clara's footsteps running up and down the stairs when she was little. Everything now felt distant, as if someone were preparing to erase it all. The next morning, Clara returned holding a cup of coffee, looking confident as though she had already won. "Mom, I scheduled an appointment with Lawyer Wilson for tomorrow afternoon. It's just a simple formality. I promise I'll take care of the house the way you always have." Helen smiled faintly. "You're very thoughtful, dear, but I think I'm still strong enough to handle my own affairs." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You don't understand, Mom. So many elderly people get scammed these days. I just want to protect you." The word protect slipped out softly, yet in Helen's mind it thundered heavy. She knew all too well what lay behind those tender words: ambition. Darren's investment had failed. Clara was burning through money on lavish vacations. They needed cash, and this house was their salvation. That afternoon, Helen brewed herself a cup of Earl Grey, the scent of bergamot filling the air. Her gaze fell on the old piano in the corner. She touched a key lightly. A hoarse note echoed the sound of the past. And in that moment, an idea flickered in her mind. If Clara wanted to test her, then she would test her daughter in return. The following evening, Helen called an old acquaintance, Mr. Mason, the antique shop owner down the street. "I'd like to sell a few things from my home, just old furniture," she said. Mason sounded surprised, but didn't ask questions. 2 days later, several chairs, tables, even the living room television were gone. When Clara and Darren arrived on Friday night, they froze at the sight of the half-empty room. "Mom, what happened here?" Clara's voice trembled. "Where's all the furniture?" Helen set down her teacup calmly. "I sold some pieces. Since you're planning to manage my finances, I thought I should have some cash first." Clara's face shifted from shock to anger. "What's wrong with you? You sold things from this house without asking me." Helen met her daughter's eyes, her tone gentle as mist, but sharp as a blade. "I thought this was my house." The air froze. Darren stepped forward, voice rising. "You can't just do whatever you want. We were planning to renovate. Now look at it." Helen stood, her movements deliberate. "Then you'll have to eat dinner somewhere else tonight. This house no longer serves guests." Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Clara stared at her mother, fury and fear mingling in her eyes. "You're destroying yourself, Mom," Helen smiled. "Maybe. But sometimes you have to break a few old things to see what's still worth keeping." As Clara and Darren left, Helen stood by the window watching their car disappear into the rain. Inside her, the trembling was gone. Only a strange calm remained, like the surface of a lake after a storm. She knew the real battle had just begun, but this time she would not be the victim. This time she would be the one writing her own story. 2 days later, Clara returned. This time she came alone without Darren. The sky was bright but heavy with gray clouds, a sign that rain was coming. Helen was watering her flowers in the garden when she heard rapid knocks at the door. When she opened it, she saw her daughter standing there, high heels splattered with mud, her face perfectly made up but stiff with tension. "Mom, we need to talk," Clara said, stepping into the house without waiting to be invited. The living room was now almost empty, with only an old armchair and a small tea table. No television, no sofa. The sound of Clara's heels echoed in the bare space. She stood in the middle of the room and turned to her mother, her expression mixed with irritation and disbelief. "You really sold everything. I thought you were bluffing." Helen set down the watering can, wiped her hands on her apron, and spoke calmly. "Those things were old. I needed to clear them out." "Doesn't the house feel lighter now?" Clara narrowed her eyes. "Lighter." "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? Darren was planning to bring clients here this weekend. I told them this was our family's vacation home, and now look what you've done." "This house is mine," Helen replied softly. "Not yours." Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. "You're doing this on purpose, aren't you? You know Darren is in financial trouble, and yet you chose this exact time to ruin everything. You're being selfish." Helen looked up at her daughter as if seeing a stranger. Each word Clara spoke stung like salt on an open wound, yet her face remained composed. "You think I'm selfish for refusing to let you sell what your father spent his entire life building." Clara folded her arms. "Dad's been gone for years, Mom. I'm just trying to protect what's left. You don't understand finances. Don't make people think you've become a burden." The word burden fell into the empty room like a stone. Helen felt her chest tighten. For a moment, she saw the little girl who once clung to her neck, crying after a fall. the young student who had written letters thanking her for an education. All of that was gone, replaced by a cold woman who spoke to her as if she were a debtor. "My dear Helen," said quietly, "if your father were still alive, he'd be ashamed to hear you say these things." Clara was silent for a moment, then let out a thin, cutting laugh. "Dad left too many responsibilities behind. Maybe he wasn't as realistic as you think. It's time you let someone else take care of you. Stop holding on." Helen's voice grew lower. "You're right. Maybe it's time I started taking care of myself." Clara frowned, not catching the meaning behind her mother's words. "What are you planning to do?" Helen didn't answer. She simply looked out the window where the first raindrops began to fall across the yard. "Go home, Clara. I'm tired." Clara sighed in frustration and turned toward the door, her heels striking hard against the tile. "Suit yourself, but don't blame me when things get out of hand." The door slammed shut. Helen sank into the armchair, her heart churning. She had never felt so alone. In her mind, Thomas's voice echoed like a whisper. "Helen, don't let anyone decide for you." She opened the small drawer of the tea table and pulled out an old set of keys. One key was dull silver, engraved with a single word: basement. She stood and walked to the end of the hallway. The door to the cellar was still locked, a thick layer of dust covering the handle. Helen inserted the key and turned it. A soft click sounded, and the wooden door creaked open as cold air drifted up from below. She turned on her flashlight, each wooden step groaning beneath her weight. The damp smell of old wood filled the air, bringing back memories of the days when Thomas used to store things there for when we might need them. In the faint yellow light, old trunks sat in neat rows. Helen knelt and opened one. Inside were Folder's insurance papers and a sealed envelope marked Gardner Property Trust. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a transfer document signed years ago, confirming that the house had been placed in a trust under her name, and an independent trustee, making it impossible to sell or transfer as long as she lived. Helen let out a quiet laugh. In the cold, musty air, her voice echoed raspy but strong. Clara had no idea. Neither did Darren. They both thought she was just a frail old woman holding on to a few useless papers. But Thomas had foreseen everything, ensuring that no one could ever take this home away from her. She sat on the steps, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "My dear daughter," she whispered, her tone soft as the wind sneaking through a door crack. "You want to see who's weaker?" "Very well. I'll show you." Thunder rumbled overhead, and the rain began to pour hard against the roof. Helen closed the basement door and locked it tight. As she climbed the stairs, a new feeling stirred inside her, not fear, but determination. The house was silent, but within its walls, another kind of storm had begun. That night, when Clara's message arrived brief and cold, "Mom, the lawyer, will come tomorrow. Please cooperate." Helen merely glanced at the screen and turned off her phone. She stood by the window, watching the darkness swallow the garden, the rose branches swaying under the rain. A thin smile curved her lips. In the stillness, she opened her old notebook and wrote, "The plan begins here." The next morning, Portland was covered in a cold, gray hue. The night's rain had stopped, but the sky still hung heavy, as if another storm was waiting to fall. Helen brewed a pot of tea, the scent of mint leaves blending with the damp smell of wood, filling the small kitchen with an oddly peaceful air. She knew this peace wouldn't last. That afternoon, the lawyer Clara had hired would arrive to handle business. She leaned against the table and closed her eyes for a moment to steady herself. Around 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. A young man in a gray suit entered with Clara carrying a leather briefcase. Her daughter's smile was bright but forced, while the man's politeness was so smooth it felt practiced. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Gardner," he said pleasantly. I'm Anthony Briggs, the legal representative for Ms. Clara and Mr. Darren. I'm here to assist you with the transfer of property ownership, just a small administrative matter entirely for your benefit." Helen invited them to sit and poured tea. She didn't answer right away, instead, watching the steam rise from her cup. "For my benefit," she asked softly. "I thought this house already belonged to me." Anthony smiled. "Of course it does for now, but as time goes on and your health eventually declines, allowing your daughter to manage things will help prevent future legal complications. It could even optimize estate taxes." "It's a smart move," Clara added gently. "Mom, I just want to make sure everything is settled properly. You don't have to worry about anything anymore." Helen looked at her daughter for a long moment, her calm gaze making Clara glance away. "That sounds lovely," she said quietly, "but I'd like to read everything before I sign." Anthony handed her a thick stack of papers. "Of course you can read them, but I assure you there's nothing in here that would harm your interests." Helen turned to the first page. The small print was dense like a spider's web. Among the lines, one clause stood out in italics. "The owner agrees to transfer full authority over the property to the primary beneficiary, including the right to sell, lease, or mortgage the property if necessary." She closed the file slightly. "If I sign this, that means my daughter can do whatever she wants with this house, including selling it, correct?" Anthony hesitated briefly before smiling again. "Technically, yes, but of course Ms. Clara would only act in your best interest." Helen stayed silent. Outside, a gust of wind rustled the curtains, the sound sharp and uneasy like a warning. "Thank you, Anthony," she said evenly, "but I don't think I'll be signing today. I need time to review this." Clary immediately lost her composure. "Mom, why do you always have to make everything so complicated? I've already taken care of everything." Helen looked up, her eyes as cold as a winter lake. "If this is truly for me, then waiting a few days shouldn't be that hard." The air turned heavy. Anthony gathered his documents, forcing a polite smile, while Clara sat stiffly, lips pressed tight. When they left, Helen walked them to the door, watching their car disappear behind the trees. In the chill of the afternoon wind, a mix of sadness and pride filled her chest. She knew she had just ignited a real storm. That night, Helen kept the lights off. She sat in the dark with only the faint moonlight spilling through the window. On the table lay the old documents she had retrieved from the basement, copies of the trust agreement life insurance papers, and a sealed envelope she had never opened. Her fingers brushed over the envelope, reading the faded handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. But don't worry, Helen. I've made sure our home will always be yours. Never let anyone make you doubt your own worth." Helen smiled faintly. The words seemed to warm the entire room. For a moment, she could almost hear Thomas's gentle laugh, the tapping of his hammer years ago as he fixed the window frame. She placed the envelope back on the table and took a deep breath. "Thank you," she whispered. "Now I know what I have to do." The next day, Clara didn't come, but a phone call from the bank told Helen things had escalated. The employee informed her that someone had filed a petition for confirmation of mental competency, the first step toward gaining legal control over her assets. The petitioner's name was Clara. Helen sat quietly at the table, the banknote in her trembling hand, though it wasn't fear that made her shake. It was the return of an old strength, the strength of a woman who had raised a child alone, survived debt loss and betrayal. She picked up the phone and called William Torres, her late husband's old lawyer friend. "I need to see you," she said firmly, "and this time I won't back down." That afternoon, Helen visited his office. The room was small, lined with books and the smell of aging paper. Torres listened as she recounted everything, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he paused for a moment before speaking. "You have nothing to worry about. Your home is protected by the trust, but you should gather evidence showing Clara's intent to commit fraud. We'll fight this legally, not emotionally." Helen nodded. "I don't want to cry anymore, William. I just want back the peace they tried to steal from me." That evening she returned home feeling heavy yet steady. The wind whispered through the hallway, carrying the scent of lavender from the back garden. Helen walked to the window and looked down the quiet street. A passing car's headlights flashed across the glass, a fleeting reminder that everything was changing. On the table, she opened her notebook and began to write the first steps of her plan. First, move all original documents to Mr. Torres's office. Second, review all bank accounts and revoke Clara's access. Third, find witnesses who can confirm that I am fully aware and in complete control of my actions. She paused, then added one final line. Fourth, make sure my daughter understands that her mother is not as weak as she thinks. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees like a promise. Helen closed the notebook and blew out the candle on the table. In the darkness, her eyes glimmered, not with fear, but with the light of a woman ready for her own fight. Monday morning, Portland was wrapped in a thin mist, everything damp and eerily quiet. Helen woke early, brewed her coffee, and sat at her wooden desk, organizing the stack of papers she had covered with notes the night before. Each sheet was a piece of her plan, no longer scattered thoughts, but a roadmap for her counterattack. At 7:30, the landline rang. Helen saw her daughter's name flash on the screen. She picked up her voice, calm. "Good morning, dear." Mom Clara's voice was tight with anger. "I just got a notice from the bank. You changed the account access. What are you doing?" "That's right," Helen said evenly. "I'm just protecting what's mine." "You don't trust me." Clara exhaled sharply, struggling to contain her frustration. "I was only trying to help. Darren's about to close a big investment deal, and I needed that money as collateral. We'd all benefit Mom." Helen smiled sadly. "Since when does we only mean you and Darren, Clara?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by heavy breathing. "If you keep being stubborn," Clara said in a low, threatening tone, "I can't promise I'll stay gentle." Helen quietly placed the receiver back down, her faint smile fading. Her calmness wasn't weakness. It was resolve. She had already decided this battle would not be fought with tears. By noon, she went to the bank to meet the branch director in person, a young woman named Meredith. Helen presented documents proving her ownership of the property trust and requested that all original records be transferred to Attorney Torres's office. Meredith reviewed the papers carefully, then looked up with a hint of admiration. "Few people your age handle things this quickly and precisely. Are you certain once the transfer is complete, no one but you and your trustee will have access?" Helen replied softly. "That's exactly what I want." When she left the bank, a light rain began to fall. Helen lifted her coat hood and walked slowly down the wet street. The drizzle reminded her of her younger days when she used to pedal through storms to reach her music lessons on time, just to make enough to pay the rent. Every step she took now echoed with the familiar rhythm of courage she thought she had lost long ago. That afternoon, a letter arrived. The envelope bore the name of Anthony Briggs's law office. Helen opened it to find a formal notice requesting a mental competency evaluation and a summons to an initial court hearing. Clara was listed as the petitioner, claiming she suspected her mother was no longer capable of managing her finances. Helen held the letter, her heart aching and cold. So her daughter was truly ready to drag her own mother to court. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and walked to the window. The rain continued soft and steady. In the garden, the roses Thomas had planted were still blooming no matter how cold the wind. "Yes," she whispered, "endurance is the most elegant form of revenge." That evening, Helen visited her longtime neighbor, Alice Morrison, who had lived next door for over 30 years. Alice greeted her with a warm smile, but her face darkened as she listened to Helen's story. "Clara's gone too far," Alice said. "I've seen selfish children before, but never one this cruel." Helen took her friend's hand. "I need a witness. If Clara tries to claim I'm confused, will you testify that I'm perfectly clear-headed?" Alice nodded firmly. "Of course. I'll do more than that. I'll make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows the truth. She won't be able to disgrace you." On her way home, Helen felt slightly lighter. She sat at her desk, opened her notebook, and wrote a few new lines. Tomorrow, prepare witness statement, duplicate trust papers, file a counterclaim. If Clara wants war, then her mother will not retreat. Late at night, the rain finally stopped. Helen poured herself a small glass of wine and sat by the window. The dim moonlight filtered through the glass, resting on her calm face. In her mind, she could already see how this would end. Clara would return, not to plead, but to demand, maybe even to threaten. But Helen was ready. She spoke softly to herself. "You think your mother only knows how to play piano and cook, but you forget a woman who raised a child alone doesn't break easily. I've survived poverty and loss while you only know how to spend what others earn." The night breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the damp scent of earth and roses. Helen lifted her glass and took a small sip. The wine was strong and bitter, yet warm, just like her life, now painful but unbroken. She set the glass down, closed her notebook, and smiled faintly, the smile of a woman who knows that dawn will come, no matter how long the night may be. On Thursday morning, Helen woke before dawn. Portland lay under a thick blanket of fog, cold and utterly silent. The wooden house radiated a soft warmth from the fireplace, the crackle of burning wood like the steady heartbeat of the home. She stood before the mirror, smoothing her silver hair, then put on her dark blue coat, Thomas's favorite color, and picked up the folder she had prepared on the table. Today she would file her counterclaim in court. The car's engine purred quietly as she drove off. The road toward downtown was empty, with only a few trucks gliding past, their headlights reflected on the misty pavement. Helen didn't drive fast yet. Inside her was a storm of determination. With every turn of the wheel, she felt as if she were driving across the span of her past years of silent endurance, of forgiving without apology, of loneliness disguised as kindness. At the courthouse, an elderly security guard greeted her with a warm smile. Helen returned the gesture with a nod and walked straight to the filing office. A young clerk stood up to help her organize the documents, speaking politely. "You're here to file a counterclaim for the competency evaluation case, correct?" "That's right." Helen said, her voice gentle but firm. "And I want to include evidence of financial misconduct by the petitioner." The clerk looked at her, surprised by the clarity and precision in her words. When she received the stamped receipt, Helen felt as though a great weight had lifted from her shoulders. Leaving the courthouse, she crossed the street to a small cafe. The smell of freshly baked pastries drifted from the kitchen, pulling her back to mornings long ago, when Clara was a little girl sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for her milk. Back then, one smile from her child could erase every trace of exhaustion. Helen inhaled deeply, then brushed the memory aside. Love could no longer be an excuse for self-destruction. She glanced at her phone, finding a flood of unread messages from Clara. "What are you doing, Mom? Are you trying to embarrass me in front of everyone? Darren says your lawyer is taking advantage of you? They just want your money. If you don't stop this, don't blame me for what happens next." Helen read them all without replying. The more she read, the more she realized her daughter had never wanted to protect her, only to protect her own interests. At noon, Helen visited William Torres's office. The elderly lawyer greeted her with a firm handshake. "I've reviewed your counterclaim," he said. "It's excellent. We'll attach the duplicate trust documents early next week. Oh, and I've confirmed something: the house cannot be sold without signatures from both co-owners, and the co-owner, as you know, is the independent trustee. Thomas appointed. Clara can't touch a penny." Helen nodded, her eyes lighting up. "Thank you, William. I don't want to create a scene, but I won't let them humiliate me anymore." William sighed softly. "You're not making a scene, Helen. You're reclaiming the respect that was always yours." By late afternoon, the clouds parted and sunlight broke through. Helen stopped by a small market near her neighborhood. She bought several bundles of lavender, some apples, and a loaf of fresh bread. The young cashier recognized her and smiled. "You look happy today, ma'am." "Something good happened." Helen smiled back. "Maybe so, dear. Today I did something I should have done years ago. I stood up for myself." When she arrived home, a black car was parked at her gate. Clara stood outside with her arms crossed. Helen parked, got out, and calmly unlocked the gate. "What are you doing here?" Clara stepped closer, her tone tense. "Mom, we need to talk. Are you really going to sue me?" Helen didn't answer right away. She opened the car trunk, took out the lavender bouquet, and walked toward the house. "Do you have any idea how it feels," she said quietly, "to see your own name listed as the defendant in your daughter's lawsuit?" Clara fell silent, her eyes flickering. "I just don't want you to be deceived. You don't understand Darren. He's only trying to keep this family together." By taking what doesn't belong to him, Helen's voice was sharp as a blade. "Do you know what I've spent my life working for so that you could have a better one? But you turned my kindness into your habit, and that habit into a sense of entitlement." Clara bit her lip, her eyes glistening. "Don't make it sound like I'm the villain. I just want to feel safe. I'm afraid of losing everything." Helen looked at her for a long time. "My dear, safety doesn't come from taking. It comes from knowing when to stop before you lose what can't be replaced, like trust." Clara turned away, her voice breaking. "If you keep doing this, I'll never forgive you." Helen gave a weary smile, equal parts sorrow and strength. "I don't need your forgiveness, Clara. I only need to live according to what your father left me: dignity and independence." Clara said nothing. Tears slid down her cheeks as she turned, storming back to her car. The door slammed shut and the tires screeched against the wet road. Helen watched her go, her anger gone, replaced only by sadness. She understood now that her daughter's greed was just fear in disguise: fear of losing control, fear of emptiness, fear of herself. Evening fell, painting the garden in soft golden light. Helen placed the lavender on the altar beside Thomas's photo. "It's all going as it should, Thomas," she whispered. "But I still wish Clara could see this isn't a battle between mother and daughter. It's between conscience and greed." That night, Helen sat at her desk to write a letter. Her handwriting was neat and steady. "If one day Lily asks why I no longer speak to her mother, tell her this: in life there are boundaries we must draw to save ourselves. And that love does not mean allowing others to trample over you." When she finished, she folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and set it aside. The clock struck 12, each chime echoing softly through the house. Helen turned off the lights and sat quietly in the dark. Outside, the wind had calmed, leaving only the distant sound of the ocean drifting through the trees. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Tomorrow they'll know. No one can take away what I've spent a lifetime protecting." The next morning, Helen woke with a strange warmth rising in her chest, a mix of anxiety and newfound energy. She brewed her coffee and turned on the radio, letting the sound of soft classical music drift through the kitchen. Everything looked the same, yet inside her, that peace felt like the still surface of a river, hiding a powerful current beneath. Today, she would face Clara again, not as a fragile mother, but as a woman ready to reclaim justice for herself. The morning passed slowly. By noon, the familiar sound of a car stopped at the gate. Helen looked through the window and saw Clara and Darren stepping out. Darren wore a black suit, his expression stern, while Clara followed behind her face, strained yet proud. Helen opened the door, her voice steady. "You're early." Darren gave a dry smile. "We just want to get this over with before it turns into gossip for the whole neighborhood." Helen quietly invited them in and sat across from them. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a golden stripe across the wooden table, dividing the space between mother and child. "I know someone's been influencing you," Mom Clara began. "I heard you went to see Mr. Torres. He's just taking advantage of you. You don't understand how the law works." Helen set her teacup down, her tone calm. "Mr. Torres is an old friend of your father's. He's helping me protect what Thomas left behind." Darren leaned back in his chair, smirking. "This house is worth nearly $600,000, Mrs. Gardner. We're not trying to steal it, just make sure it's profitable. You need to understand how modern people think money shouldn't sit idle inside walls." Helen looked at him steadily, her eyes calm as still water, yet burning with quiet fire. "True, but not everyone has the right to turn someone else's home into their investment." The air thickened. Clara looked around, perhaps searching for the softness she used to see in her mother, but this time she found only firmness, even coldness. "Do you really want to take me to court, Mom?" Clara's voice wavered. "You'd call the police on your own family." Helen tilted her head slightly. "Did you think of that before you listed me as the defendant in your petition?" The question fell softly, but its edge was sharp as a knife. Darren slammed his hand on the table. "We don't want this to get ugly, but if you keep being stubborn, you'll lose everything. We have proof that you're not mentally stable, old hospital records prescriptions for sedatives. We'll show them to the court." Helen let out a dry, brittle laugh that echoed through the quiet room. "Those papers are from 7 years ago when I lost my husband. If grief makes one insane, then the whole world needs guardians." Clara lowered her head silent. Darren stood, his eyes cold. "You have 2 days to reconsider. After that, our lawyer will proceed." He pulled Clara to her feet, but as they reached the door, Helen spoke clearly, each word deliberate. "You won't win. This house is protected. Every document is safe. And if it comes to it, the court will see who's really unstable, the person who took out a loan in someone else's name." Darren froze, whipping around. "What are you talking about?" Helen smiled, her gaze sharp as steel. "I know about the $250,000 loan. I also have a copy of the contract naming me as guarantor with a signature that isn't mine." Clara went pale. Darren gripped her hand tightly and dragged her out without another word. When the sound of their car faded, Helen sat down, her hands trembling. A wave of emotions washed over her: fear, relief, pain. But beneath it all was something deeper: freedom. For the first time in 64 years, she had spoken without hesitation, without hiding, without apology. That afternoon, she met with William Torres and told him everything. He listened with quiet respect. "You have everything we need," he said. "I'll request a signature verification from both the bank and the court. If the forgery is confirmed, we won't just counterclaim, we'll press criminal charges." Helen nodded. "Do it. I don't want revenge, William. I just want this to end." When she returned home, the late sunlight spilled through the trees, gilding her silver hair with gold. She paused by the rose garden, her simple joy in the mornings now replaced by reflection. She thought of Thomas and his words. People are only weak when they believe they have nothing left to lose. Now she understood the one thing she could never lose was her dignity. That evening, Helen sat at her desk and wrote a letter to William, enclosing copies of the old documents. When she finished, she looked around the house, the faded walls, the framed family photos, the silent piano. Everything felt peaceful, as though the house itself was exhaling, relieved that its owner had finally stood tall. Before going to bed, she opened the window. The night breeze carried the scent of damp earth and lavender. In the darkness, Helen whispered, "Tomorrow I'll teach piano again. I'll start over, not for anyone else, but for me." She closed the window, and the moonlight fell softly over the garden, illuminating the figure of a small but unyielding woman, slipping into restful sleep, the sleep of someone who had finally stopped being afraid. Saturday morning, the sun rose late. Mist still clung thickly to the lavender bushes outside the porch. Helen woke earlier than usual. The heaviness that had weighed in her chest for weeks was gone, replaced by a strange calm, as if the storm within her had passed and left behind dry ground ready for new seeds. She brewed her coffee and opened the thick notebook she had filled with notes over the past few weeks, turning to the last page. The ink was smudged, the lines uneven, but each word still carried the power of a vow. Never retreat, never fear, never forget who you are. She sat at her desk and pulled from the drawer a small folder sealed in clear plastic, the documents Thomas had left behind, things Clara never knew existed. Inside, along with the trust agreement, there was an older, yellowed paper bearing the signature of an insurance company. Helen read the first line again. Beneficiary Helen Gardner. Life insurance amount $120,000. She held her breath, her eyes trembling. That paper was the final piece of the truth Thomas had hidden. He hadn't just protected their house. He had left her a safety net for the future. And now that moment had come. She picked up the phone and called the insurance company, asking to confirm the records. The woman on the other end said a representative would come to verify everything early next week. Helen thanked her voice so calm that even she found it strange. Months ago, she would have been shaking with fear, but now every word came slowly, deliberately. When she hung up, she looked around the house and realized that every detail seemed to stand on her side. The faded walls, the scuffed wooden floor, the photograph of Thomas on the piano. It was as if they were all whispering to her, "Stand firm, Helen." That afternoon, she visited Alice Morrison. Her elderly neighbor welcomed her with the scent of waffles and ginger tea. "Are you all right?" Alice asked kindly. Helen sat in the armchair, breathing in the fragrant tea. "Better than ever," she replied. "I just discovered Thomas left me more than I ever imagined." She told Alice about the insurance document, her voice calm but full of emotion. Alice listened quietly, then reached for her hand. "He always believed you were strong enough to protect yourself." "I think he was right." Helen smiled, her eyes glistening. "This time I won't let him down." As the sun set, Helen walked home, the breeze brushing through her silver hair. She went down to the basement once more. The yellow light spilled over the wooden chests, dust sparkling in the narrow beam. She pulled out a small trunk and opened it. Inside were old keepsakes, the letter Thomas had written, the year they married, an old photo frame, a few unfinished music sheets. At the bottom was a small metal box with a tiny lock. Helen slipped in a key from the chain she always wore around her neck. When the lid opened, inside were several sealed envelopes, each labeled in Thomas's handwriting. She took one marked "Basement for Emergency." Inside was a duplicate copy of the trust agreement and the insurance certificate. She smiled, a mix of tenderness and sorrow. "You were so careful, Thomas. Nearly 30 years later, you're still protecting me in your own way." Helen sat on the cool floor, her back against the wooden wall. The air smelled of old wood and metal, grounding her between two worlds, past and present. She murmured, if Clara knew about all this, what would she do? Sell it, burn it, or cry and pretend she's sorry? She was silent for a long while, then shook her head. No, she's not ready to understand, but I am. Late that night, Helen wrote a new letter. Unlike the ones before filled with guilt and hesitation, this one was firm, every word clear and steady. To Attorney Torres, I hereby authorize you to oversee all my assets, including the reaffirmation of the property trust and the insurance benefits. In the event of my death or loss of capacity, I want all benefits transferred to Lily Gardner, my granddaughter. No one else. As she signed her name, she felt her heart beat strong again, her blood pulsing with the rhythm of someone who had remembered how to fight for what was right. The next day, a message came from William Torres. Everything has gone smoothly. The bank has confirmed the records. The house and the insurance are both fully protected. Helen read the message several times, each word striking her eyes, not with fear, but with relief. At last, she had won the game. Others tried to trap her in. That afternoon, Clara called. Her voice shook with anger. What did you do with the house? Why can't I access the files anymore? Helen stood by the window watching the sky turn bronze. I only did what's right, Clara. The house is no longer something you can bargain with. You'll regret this, Clara shouted. You've destroyed this family. Helen replied softly. A family can't be destroyed by truth, only by lies. And you chose lies. After hanging up, Helen stood still for a long time. She didn't cry. What filled her now wasn't pain, but a deep, quiet calm, as if every tear she'd ever shed had turned into stone and settled at the bottom of her soul. As night fell, she walked through the house checking the windows, then sat in her old armchair. Outside, a full moon hung over the black sky, lighting the small garden below. Helen turned on the radio, and the sound of Debussy's piano drifted through the room, the same piece she once taught Clara as a child. The melody sounded different now, no longer innocent, but deep, wistful, and free. Do you see, Thomas? Helen whispered. I've kept everything, not just the house, but my dignity. They thought I was weak, but they forgot a woman who has survived loss is never afraid again. She leaned back, closing her eyes as the music filled the room. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of lavender across the porch. That night, Helen dreamed she was standing on a hillside bathed in dawn light. Thomas stood in the distance smiling while young Clara ran toward her, her golden hair flying in the wind. Helen reached out to embrace her, but the child only ran past laughing and vanished into the light. Helen did not feel sadness. In that dream, she understood some things must be let go before peace can return. When she woke, the morning sun was bright and clear. Birds sang outside the window. Helen sat up and took a deep breath. The battle wasn't over, but she knew exactly who was in control now. And for the first time in years, she felt no longer alone in her own home. She was alive again, not as someone's mother, but as herself, Helen Gardner, the woman who had learned to stand tall on her own in the heart of the storm. The next morning, the first message Helen received was from Attorney Torres. The court has accepted your counterclaim. The hearing is scheduled for next Wednesday. She read the lines slowly, as if carving each word into her memory. Part of her felt relieved, the other part ached. Though she had prepared herself for this moment, she still couldn't stop thinking about what it would mean to face her own daughter in court. A familiar sadness rose inside her, heavy, but no longer strong enough to crush her. She closed the phone gently and whispered to herself, if this is the only way Clara will learn the limits of greed, then let it come. Portland that day was touched with soft sunlight. Helen opened the windows, letting the breeze sweep through the room. She heard the sound of cars passing and children laughing in the neighbor's yard. Everything was painfully ordinary. She brewed a pot of tea, carried it out to the porch, and sat in her wicker chair. The sunlight fell across the blooming garden, each rose trembling slightly in the wind. She thought of Thomas, remembering his words. A person is only truly strong when they dare to face what they fear most. Today, she knew she was doing exactly that. By noon, William Torres called to say the verification of her insurance documents was complete. "Helen, you don't just have the trust," he said. "According to the records, that insurance policy is still active, untouched. When needed, it can serve as a legal safeguard or a secure retirement fund." Helen smiled faintly. "Maybe Thomas is still protecting me in his own way." William chuckled. "Perhaps he knew one day you would need this strength." That afternoon, an email arrived from Clara titled, "Your Last Chance to Make Peace." Helen opened it. The message was full of tears but laced with calculation. "Mom, I don't want to go to court. I just need you to re-sign the transfer papers. I promise I won't sell the house. I just want us to be at peace. If you keep pushing, everyone will know about this disgrace. Please, Mom, think again." Helen finished reading with an eerie calm. She knew it wasn't her daughter's plea, but the fear of someone losing control. She didn't reply. Instead, she printed the email and added it to her growing stack of documents. In this battle, everything could become evidence. 2 days later, Clara appeared unexpectedly. Helen heard the car stop at the gate, followed by angry pounding on the door. She didn't rush to open it. "Mom, open the door." Clara's voice was hoarse. Helen turned the latch. The door swung open, and though only a few feet separated them, it felt like a vast canyon. Clara had lost her usual polished composure. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "What are you doing?" she shouted. "Do you want to humiliate me in front of the whole city?" Helen stood tall, her tone even. "I'm only defending the truth. If you call that humiliation, that's your choice." Clara stepped inside, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to protect our future. Darren's in trouble. If you just help this once, I swear I'll give everything back." Helen looked at her daughter, a sad smile flickering. "You say our future, but you only mean yours. You've forgotten that my future doesn't belong in your hands." Clara was speechless. For a fleeting second, Helen saw something like regret in her daughter's eyes, but it quickly vanished, replaced by anger. "You've changed," Clara said bitterly. "You used to be kind, selfless. Now you're cold, cruel. You're not the mother I loved." Helen closed her eyes, drew a deep breath, and then looked up, her gaze sharp and clear. "No, I haven't changed. I was just too gentle before, and you got used to taking advantage of it. Now I'm simply reclaiming what I should never have given away." The air grew so heavy it could be cut with a knife. Clara stood frozen for a moment, then turned sharply toward the door. Her voice cracked as she said, "I hate you." Helen said nothing. When the door slammed shut, she sat down in silence. A beam of light slipped through the curtain, falling across her lined yet luminous face. She whispered, "If hating me teaches you something, then hate me." That night, Helen barely slept. She walked down the hallway, her fingers tracing the frames on the wall photos of Clara as a child, wedding pictures, Thomas's portrait. They seemed to watch her, silently judging and encouraging all at once. At the last frame, a summer photo by the lake, she stopped. Clara was 8 years old, laughing brightly, holding up a bouquet of lavender. Helen pressed her hand against the glass, her voice trembling. "That little girl, I still love her, but I can't let the woman she's become destroy me." The next morning, William called again. "Helen, you should know this. Clara's side just filed to withdraw the competency petition. They must have realized they can't win. But I advise you to attend court anyway to finalize the counterclaim and make the record public. After that, it will all be over." Helen was quiet for a moment, then replied, "I'll be there. I need to hear them admit it." Wednesday, the courtroom was packed. When Helen walked in, the room fell silent. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table, pale and tense. Darren was beside her, trying to look composed, but his eyes betrayed worry. Helen took her place at the stand, small but upright. The judge asked a few basic questions, and she answered clearly, firmly. When it was her turn to present, she laid out everything: the trust contract, the insurance papers, the forged loan agreement, and the pleading email from Clara. The courtroom was so quiet one could hear a pin drop. The judge flipped through the documents, then turned to Clara. "Do you have any response?" Clara bowed her head, her fists clenched. Darren started to speak, but Clara stopped him, tears spilling down her cheeks. I was wrong." The words were so soft they almost dissolved in the air, but everyone heard them. Helen closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. A wave of emotion surged through her chest, pain and relief intertwined. The hearing ended quickly. Clara was ordered to repay the loan taken in her mother's name and was formally warned for financial misconduct. Helen didn't ask for further compensation. She only said one thing before leaving: "I don't need money. I just need respect." When she stepped outside, the sunlight hit her face so brightly she had to squint. William walked beside her, murmuring, "You won." Helen shook her head. "No one wins, William. There are only those who learn and those who don't." That evening, she returned home, brewed tea, and took it out to the porch. A gentle breeze carried the scent of lavender through the yard. She sat quietly watching the sunset paint the rooftops in red and gold. Everything felt peaceful, as if the storm had never happened. Helen took a sip of tea, bitter yet sweet, like the taste of her life. In the stillness, she whispered, "Thomas, it's over. The house will stay, and Lily will grow up without learning this lesson through tears." Across the street, Alice was watering her plants. She looked over, smiled, and waved. Helen returned the gesture with a tired but radiant smile, the smile of someone who had walked a long road and finally found herself again. The sky that evening was extraordinarily bright, as if the entire city was breathing a sigh of relief for a woman who had stopped being silent, who had chosen to stand up, and who had triumphed not through hatred, but through the kind of dignity no one could ever take away. 3 weeks after the trial, Portland shifted seasons. The trees along the boulevard had turned golden, their leaves falling and rolling across the damp streets. Helen sat by the window of her old house, a cup of steaming tea in her hands. The air was fresh and still, yet a faint emptiness lingered in her chest. Everything had ended just as she had hoped. Justice served her. Home protected, her dignity restored. But the victory carried a quiet bitterness. There was no joy, no triumph, only a deep, hollow calm, as if life had finally finished teaching her a lesson that cost too much. That morning, the postman delivered an envelope. In the top left corner was a familiar handwriting, Clara Gardner. Helen held it for a long while, torn between anticipation and caution, before gently tearing the edge open. Inside were only a few brief lines. "Mom, I was wrong. I don't know who I've become. I'm leaving Portland for a while, maybe longer. I'm sorry for everything. When you're ready, please forgive me." There was no return address, only a dried lavender blossom pressed between the pages. Helen read the letter over and over, her expression softening. The anger and pain faded slowly, like morning fog lifting from the hills. She placed the letter on the table and gave a small, wistful smile. "At least you still know how to bow your head," she murmured. Then she folded it neatly and tucked it inside her notebook with the old notes as if burying it somewhere only she could find. That afternoon, Alice stopped by with a basket of apples. I heard Clara's left the city. She said, her tone a mix of curiosity and sympathy. "Are you all right?" Helen nodded. "I am. I've grown used to the quiet." They sat together on the porch as golden sunlight bathed the garden and the scent of lavender floated in the breeze. Alice looked around and said softly, "This house is beautiful. It feels like a place that knows how to keep secrets." Helen laughed gently. "Maybe it is. It's protected me for years, and now it's helping me stand again." That evening, Helen opened her piano. It had been a long time since she last touched the keys. The sound that came out was rough but warm. She began to play Claire de Lune Thomas's favorite piece. The melody drifted through the room, mingling with the whisper of wind outside. When the final note faded, tears rolled down her cheeks, but they no longer burned. They were tears of someone who had learned that forgiveness is not weakness, it is freedom. The next day, Helen visited the bank to meet with Meredith, the branch manager. She wanted to open a new account, not to store money, but to begin something new, a small fund called the Gardner Hope Fund. When Meredith asked about it, Helen smiled. "I want to help older women who are being financially exploited by their children or relatives. They need to know they have the right to protect themselves." Meredith looked at her thoughtfully. "That's a beautiful idea. Few people are brave enough to do that." Helen replied, "I've been silent long enough. It's time to speak for those who can't." That evening, she wrote a letter to William Torres asking for his help with the fund's legal process. At the end, she added a single line, "Thank you for helping me find my voice again. I think the greatest thing I've managed to keep isn't the house, but the belief that I can still begin anew." One late morning near the end of the month, while Helen was watering her flowers, a small car stopped at the gate. The door opened and out ran Lily, her little granddaughter. "Grandma." The girl threw herself into Helen's arms, her golden hair flying in the wind. Helen hugged her tightly, warmth spreading through her whole being. "Mom brought me here," Lily said in her clear, sweet voice. "She told me to give you this." The girl handed her a small box. Inside was an old silver necklace, its pendant engraved with the name Helen. "Mom said you left it at the old house. She said she'll write you soon." Helen's hands trembled as she held the necklace, her grip tightening around it. She didn't need a letter. This small gesture was enough. Clara was finding her way back, and Helen knew she had already opened the door to forgive her. That afternoon, Helen and Lily baked together the kitchen filled with the scent of apples and cinnamon. Grandma Lily asked, "Why aren't you mad at Mom anymore?" Helen gently stroked her granddaughter's hair, her eyes soft as sunlight. "Because being angry doesn't help, my dear. Sometimes it takes a lifetime for grown-ups to learn how to let go. Forgiveness isn't for others, it's so we can sleep peacefully at night." As the sun set, Helen took Lily out to the porch. They sat side by side watching the sky turn pink with dusk. In that moment, Helen realized life was still moving forward, gentle, quiet, and whole. All the pain, betrayal, and tears had been washed away under that evening glow. That night, Helen wrote in her journal, "Every path has its turns, and sometimes love must walk through darkness to return to its true meaning. I am no longer afraid of losing anyone, because in the end, I have found myself again." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of lavender across the porch. Helen closed the journal and turned off the lights. The house fell into peaceful darkness, the moonlight spilling across the wooden floor. As she passed the piano, she laid her hand gently on the keys. A faint note echoed steady and alive like the heartbeat of life itself. Helen smiled softly and whispered, "Thomas, do you see I'm all right now? And our daughter, she'll learn to love again." Then she closed the door behind her, leaving the quiet house filled with the lingering scent of lavender. And in that small home, Helen Gardner had finally found what she had lost for so many years, the peace of a woman who knows she has survived the storm and will never again bow her head to anyone. The following spring, Portland felt clearer and warmer than ever before. Morning sunlight streamed through the trees, casting a soft glow over the porch where Helen sat making tea. The scent of lavender and freshly baked waffles filled the air. She looked up and took a deep breath. Everything around her was calm and bright, as if the house itself could finally breathe again after years of silence. Clara had been gone for nearly a year. Lily still visited on weekends, and Helen had learned to enjoy the slow passing of days without the shadow of worry. In the first weeks after the trial, she had felt empty, as if she had won but didn't know what to do with her newfound freedom. But as time passed, she came to understand that this stillness was her reward. No more harsh phone calls, no more anxiety each time an unfamiliar car stopped outside. The house was now truly hers, not just on paper, but in spirit. She started planting more flowers, repainting the fence, and hanging a small wooden sign on the porch that read, "Gardner Hope Fund." Each week, Helen welcomed a few women into her home. Most were neighbors or people introduced by Alice. They sat together, drinking tea, sharing stories not so different from her own. A year earlier, children seizing property, relatives stealing money. Helen listened without judgment, speaking softly but firmly. "I was once just as afraid as you are. But when you start protecting yourself, you stop feeling guilty for saying no." That sentence spread throughout the community. Within months, the name Gardner Hope Fund appeared in the local newspaper. One afternoon, Helen received a call from a familiar voice, Clara's. Her tone was soft and fragile, but no longer bitter. "Mom, I just wanted to know if you're doing okay." Helen paused for a moment, then answered, "I'm fine. I've been busy teaching people how to be strong." Clara let out a shaky laugh. "You've always been stronger than I thought." Both fell silent. The conversation was brief, but after it ended, Helen felt her heart loosen. She knew the bond between them still existed. It just needed time to be rebuilt with honesty instead of lies. As evening fell, Helen sat on the porch surrounded by the rich scent of flowers. She opened her old notebook and wrote the final lines. "It took me many years to understand that love is not endurance. Sometimes letting go is the only way to preserve kindness. I no longer seek victory. I only seek peace." When the sun set, Lily called, her voice excited. Mom said she's coming to visit you soon." Helen smiled, her eyes glistening. "Really? Then I'd better bake an apple pie." She ended the call and looked out at the garden where the last light of day turned the roses to gold. A gentle breeze carried the scent of lavender through the open window. Helen whispered as if to Thomas, as if to herself, "In the end, everything has found its place." She took a sip of tea, the steady ticking of the clock echoing through the quiet house. There was no more fear, no more bitterness. Only a woman who had walked through every storm now smiling in the soft glow of the fading sun, free, whole, and at peace, like the final breath of spring itself.